Grace doesn't wait for an invitation. It doesn't wait for the perfect timing or for us to have everything together. It just steps into our lives, unexpected, unasked for, and often disruptive. In this message, we explore Luke 5, where Jesus climbs into Peter's boat without asking, turning an ordinary, frustrating day into the start of something extraordinary. How does grace show up in our own lives? How does it challenge us, transform us, and call us into something greater? Join us as we reflect on the disruptive, beautiful power of grace.
So grace doesn't always wait for an invitation. Grace, God's love freely given, doesn't always wait for the timing of things to be perfect either. Sometimes it just steps right into our lives, unexpected, unasked for, and often disruptive. In Luke chapter 5, we see Jesus doing exactly that. He climbs into Peter's boat without asking if it's a good time, without checking Peter's schedule, and without considering whether Peter had the energy or the desire to help. Jesus just steps in. And in doing so, he turns Peter's ordinary, frustrated day into the beginning of an extraordinary journey. This is how God's grace often works. It doesn't wait for us to have it all together. It doesn't wait for us to clean up our nets first or finish our to-do lists or get our lives in order. Grace steps in, disrupts our plans, and invites us into something far greater than we could have imagined. Sometimes it's really hard to have something unexpected happen to us. Simon, Peter, James, and John had just come off this long, exhausting night of fishing. They'd worked hard, followed all the rules, and yet their nets were empty. Simon was tired, frustrated, probably ready to call it a day. But then Jesus stepped into his boat. He didn't ask Peter whether it was a good time. He didn't wait for Peter to invite him. He just climbed in and said, "Hey, put out a little from the shore." Isn't that how grace often works? It meets us in our frustration, in our emptiness, in our exhaustion. It doesn't wait for us to be ready. It steps in and says, "Let's try this again, but this time with me." Grace doesn't ask for permission, it just shows up. So I'm going to make the assumption this morning that Peter and Jesus know each other already, or at least they've heard about one another. Simon, James, and John own this fishing business together. They're well respected. Jesus obviously is well respected with a mob of people struggling to press in on him too. And if we make that assumption, then maybe it isn't so hard to believe that when Jesus gets into the boat and asks Simon to put out a little way, Simon was like, "Sure, no problem. I'll take you out on the boat." He didn't complain about being tired or having just cleaned his nets. He just did what Jesus asked. And guess what? He got the best seat in the house for Jesus' teaching. Plus, when Jesus was done, he told Simon to cast his nets again. Now, Simon was probably thinking, "All right, so we've fished all night and we didn't catch anything. What makes you think that we're going to catch anything now?" But Simon didn't argue. If he did, Luke doesn't tell us. He just said, "Okay, whatever you say." And boom, they caught a ton of fish. When Peter saw the miraculous catch, he didn't celebrate. You'd think that he would. Professional fishermen and all, right? Instead, he fell to his knees and said, "Go away from me, Lord. I'm a sinful man." And in that moment, Peter saw himself clearly a flawed, broken person in the presence of the holy. But Jesus didn't waver. Jesus said, "Don't be afraid, for now you will fish for people." Or, closer to the Greek, you will be catching people. Grace doesn't disrupt our plans, it disrupts our understanding of ourselves and of our God. It shows us our brokenness, but it also shows us God's love and calling. It reminds us that we are not defined by our failures, but by God's love for us and for the world. The story ends with Peter, James, and John leaving everything to follow Jesus. They left their nets, their boats, and their biggest catch ever to step into a new calling. Leaving that catch of fish behind also meant leaving lots of money behind as well. I'm sure the tax collector who was counting fish that day was really, really grateful when they came in. And see, friends, grace didn't just disrupt their day, it disrupted their entire lives. And in doing so, it brought them into something far greater than they could have ever imagined. And grace still does that today. It steps into our lives, disrupts our plans, and calls us into God's way of doing things. It invites us to leave behind what's comfortable and familiar and to follow Jesus into the unknown. I'm reminded of a story of a young woman named Sarah. She had her life all planned out, graduated college, land a stable job, get married, and start a family. She worked hard, checked all those boxes, and was on track to achieve her dreams. But then grace stepped in. One day while she was volunteering at a local shelter, Sarah met a young boy named Miguel. He was shy with big brown eyes and a smile that could light up the room. Miguel had been in and out of foster homes, and his future was uncertain. But Sarah felt a tug on her heart, a sense that she was supposed to do something. But it didn't make sense. She wasn't married, she didn't necessarily have a home, and had no experience with parenting. But grace doesn't wait for us to be ready. It just steps in. And against all logic, Sarah began the process of becoming a foster parent. It disrupted her plans, her career, and her relationships. Friends and family questioned her decision. This isn't the right time, they said. You're not ready. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this is what God was calling her to do. And a year later, Sarah was officially Miguel's foster mom. It wasn't easy. There were sleepless nights and tough conversations and moments of doubt. But there's also joy, love, and a sense of purpose she had never known before. Grace had disrupted her life, but it had also brought her into something far greater than she could have ever imagined. Through Miguel, Sarah learned what it meant to love sacrificially, to trust God's timing, and to step into a calling she never saw coming. Sarah's story is a lot like Peter's, maybe even some of our own. Grace steps into our lives, disrupts her plans, and calls her into something greater. It didn't wait for her to be ready or for the timing to be perfect. It just showed up and said, "Follow me." That's what grace does. Grace doesn't wait for an invitation. It steps into our boats, into our lives, into our frustration, into our plans, and into everything. It disrupts us, but it also transforms us. It shows us who we are and reveals who God is, and it calls us into something greater. So here's the question. Will we let grace disrupt us? Will we let it step into our boats even when it's not a good time? Will we let it challenge our plans or our expertise and our comfort? And when it does, will we respond like Peter, saying, "Yes, Lord," or even when it doesn't make sense? Or will we find ourselves echoing the words of Isaiah, even though we have no idea we're saying them at the time, "Here I am, send me"? Because here's the truth. Grace is always worth it. Ever known grace? It always leads us into something more deeper, something beautiful, something more than we could have ever imagined or experienced on our own. Grace is always asking more of ourselves than we think we've got in us. Grace is always urging us to stand up for what's right, not what's popular. Grace is, frankly, crazy. And so are we a little bit if we follow Jesus. But then Jesus says, don't be afraid. Maybe that's what we need to hear, especially with all the stuff that's going on around us in the world. Don't be afraid. My grace is sufficient for you and for the world. I promise you that, Jesus says. And I say, may it be so, dear Jesus. May it be so.
That's this week's episode of Peace Lutheran Sermons podcast. Don't forget to join us next week for another episode. Thank you for listening.